The safety of the almost 40-year-old Coburg nuclear power station in the Western Cape is once again being questioned. This comes as Eskom is planning to extend the operating life of the power utility for another 20 years.
Let's talk to you straight, because what just happened in Africa deserves your full attention. While the world keeps lecturing Africa about energy insecurity and poor infrastructure, something historic just unfolded quietly on the southern edge of the continent. South Africa's Coburg nuclear power plant, the only operational nuclear facility in all of Africa, has officially secured a 20-year license extension, guaranteeing clean, stable power all the way to 2045. No global announcement, no Western applause, just Africans proving they can operate some of the most complex infrastructure on Earth with precision and long-term discipline. And that's why you're here, because this isn't just a South African story. This is a continental message, a rewrite of the narrative, a reminder that Africa is not waiting for permission to run advanced technology. Africa is already doing it. But how did Coburg pull this off? And why does this extension matter so much for the continent's future? Let's find out. Let's start this with absolute honesty. If you asked global analysts 20 years ago whether an African nation could run a nuclear power plant safely for decades, most of them would have laughed. They would have cited stereotypes about unstable grids, weak institutions, insufficient technical expertise, and all the usual condescending phrases used to downplay African capability. And yet, as those same analysts sit in their air-conditioned offices writing pessimistic reports, Africa just quietly pulled off something that forces them to rewrite their assumptions from scratch. Coburg Nuclear Power Plant, standing tall near Cape Town since the early 1980s, has officially secured a 20-year operating license extension for Unit 2. That means this African nuclear facility is now authorized to operate until 2045. Not because someone felt generous, not because the regulator wanted a headline, but because Coburg proved, through rigorous evaluation, that it meets every single safety, structural, and regulatory standard expected of a world-class nuclear installation. Let's speak plainly for a moment. Nuclear regulators do not compromise. They do not issue partial approvals. They do not say, close enough. Either the plant meets the long-term operational criteria, or it doesn't. Coburg met them, fully, completely, confidently. This was not a shallow review. The National Nuclear Regulator conducted a detailed, multi-year assessment covering everything from seismic safety to reactor pressure vessel integrity, emergency protocols, steam generator performance, radiation containment, cooling systems, personnel training levels, and compliance with international nuclear operations standards. The process is so strict that even some European facilities struggle to pass on the first attempt. Yet Coburg did. This is where the story gets even more powerful. This extension for Unit 2 comes right after Unit 1 received its own license renewal last year. So South Africa didn't just renew one reactor. They secured both units, planting a flag in the future and saying, Africa will have nuclear stability for the next 2 decades. This alone shatters decades of global stereotypes. For years, Africa was told that nuclear energy was too advanced, too sensitive, too technical for the continent. Meanwhile, Coburg was quietly doing what many developed countries still haven't mastered, maintaining nuclear reactors safely for 40 consecutive years. Let that sink in. South Africa built this plant in the 1980s, ran it through political transitions, economic ups and downs, leadership changes, and shifting global energy landscapes. And yet the plant never lost its status as one of the continent's most reliable energy assets. That level of stability doesn't happen by accident. It happens through discipline, technical expertise, and the dedication of thousands of African professionals who spent their careers perfecting a system many outsiders assumed would fail. And now that the world sees Coburg thriving into 2045, the conversation has shifted. Africa isn't the continent trying to catch up. Africa is the continent proving what's possible when talent, training, and long-term vision align. So now we must ask the bigger question. Why does securing these 20 extra years of nuclear operation matter so much for Africa's long-term energy future? Well, this 20-year extension matters because it locks in 1,860 megawatts of clean, reliable, round-the-clock electricity for South Africa, and by extension, the entire African energy conversation. If you want to understand the true power of this moment, you have to understand what nuclear energy actually represents. It's not just another energy source, it's the backbone of a stable modern grid. And that's exactly what Africa needs: stability, predictability, and long-term reliability. Because what happens when the sun sets on solar plants? What happens when the wind slows over turbines? What happens when drought lowers water levels at hydro dams? Africa knows the answer all too well. Power cuts, factory.
Why is it that we are advocating for nuclear to power Africa's electricity needs? Unlike popular renewable sources of power such as solar and wind, nuclear power is not
Shutdowns, economic losses, public frustration, and the painful cycle of load shedding that reshapes daily life in ways the rest of the world can barely imagine. Nuclear, however, doesn't care about weather, time, or climate. It works when everything else pauses. It delivers constant baseload power, the type of electricity that keeps steel plants running at 2 a.m., keeps hospitals fully operational during storms, keeps data centers stable even when national demand spikes, and keeps a country from sliding into the chaos of unpredictable blackouts. This is the kind of power that supports industries, attracts investment, stabilizes currencies, and protects economies from collapse. Coburg's two units together produce 1,860 megawatts, not peak power, not intermittent power, but a steady, unbroken supply. That's the real magic. Whether the grid is stressed or calm, whether winter demand surges or summer heat spikes, Coburg keeps its output strong. That reliability is almost impossible to replace. If Coburg disappeared tomorrow, South Africa would instantly lose a large chunk of its stable baseload, throwing the country into an energy crisis that would take years and billions to recover from. And now, with the new license extension, South Africa doesn't have to face that disaster. Instead of scrambling to build temporary fixes, the country has secured the one thing every energy transition desperately needs: time. 20 years to be exact. Time to build renewable infrastructure properly. Time to expand transmission lines. Time to scale up storage solutions like large-capacity batteries. Time to diversify the energy mix without risking national collapse. This also gives investors confidence. You can't grow a manufacturing sector, a mining sector, or a digital economy if you're worried about daily electricity instability. With Coburg secured until 2045, South Africa can attract industries that depend on consistent power: EV factories, smelters, hydrogen production plants, tech hubs, and more. That's the quiet economic impact nobody talks about, but it changes everything. And here's where it gets even more powerful. Africa as a whole benefits from this psychological shift. When one African nation proves nuclear stability over 4 decades, it gives every other African nation permission to dream bigger, plan bolder, and trust in their own capability. But this raises a deeper question. What message does Coburg send to other African countries that are now exploring nuclear power for themselves? Here's the truth that global powers are silently wrestling with. Coburg's success destroys one of the longest-running myths about Africa: that the continent can't handle highly advanced, high-risk, high-precision technology without foreign supervision. For decades, Western commentators repeated that narrative with confidence, as if it were a universal law. They claimed Africa wasn't ready for nuclear power. They said Africans lacked the discipline, the regulatory frameworks, the engineering culture. They insisted that any nuclear attempt would lead to disaster, corruption, or mismanagement. But then reality stepped in, and reality looked nothing like their predictions. Because here's what actually happened. Africa built a nuclear plant, ran it safely for over 40 years, and just earned regulatory approval that many richer countries still struggle to get. Coburg didn't wobble. It didn't make headlines for meltdowns or scandals. It simply worked, quietly, consistently, professionally. And it kept South Africa's grid alive through some of the hardest economic and political periods in the country's history. This plant didn't just operate, it excelled, and the world noticed. Suddenly, the countries that used to lecture Africa about energy maturity are the same ones now dealing with aging nuclear parks, decommissioning reactors, or scrambling to restart nuclear programs they once abandoned. Meanwhile, Africa, the continent they dismissed, has emerging nuclear ambitions in motion. Egypt is building the massive El Dabaa nuclear plant, a 4,800 megawatt megaproject set to become one of the largest on the continent. Nigeria is in active discussions with global partners for small modular reactors that can power industrial zones. Kenya has quietly built a nuclear energy regulatory authority, preparing the groundwork for its first reactor. Ghana, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia have all taken formal steps toward nuclear adoption, training engineers, drafting legislation, signing cooperation agreements, and engaging global experts. Why? Because Coburg proved something that can't be debated anymore. Africa isn't too risky for nuclear power. Africa is ready.
Developing nuclear energy will lead to knowledge exchange and partnership among countries. This will foster technological advancement in science and in
Coburg gave every African nation a template, not an abstract dream, not a theoretical model, but living evidence. Evidence that complex regulatory compliance is achievable. Evidence that nuclear culture can flourish on African soil. Evidence that Africans can run, maintain, and secure high-precision infrastructure better than the world expects. And do you know what that does? It breaks psychological barriers. For decades, African nations were conditioned to believe they should aim small, keep it simple, stay realistic. Coburg shatters that mindset. It tells African policymakers, aim bigger, go further. Don't limit yourselves to imported diesel generators or aid-funded solar panels. Africa can build and manage systems operating at the highest level of global engineering. But that brings us to the heart of the matter, because the world never expected Coburg to succeed at this scale for this long. Which forces us to ask, what exactly allowed Coburg to run safely, sustainably, and professionally for 4 straight decades, even when global experts doubted it? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel. You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The secret is not the reactor. The secret is the people. Coburg's greatest strength is the African workforce behind it. Every control panel, every maintenance cycle, every safety drill, every emergency protocol, every inspection, these were run by Africans engineers trained to global nuclear standards. Technicians who understand the heartbeat of a reactor the way a doctor understands the rhythm of a patient. Safety teams that treat every shift like a mission. Regulators who refuse to compromise on a single requirement. And senior operators who have spent decades absorbing the knowledge passed down from earlier generations. Do you realize how significant that is? This is not a foreign-dominated plant. This is not a charity project. This is not some outsourced miracle supervised by Western experts. Coburg is living proof that Africans mastered nuclear engineering and built their own culture of safety, something many Western institutions never imagined would happen on African soil. Think about the level of discipline required. Nuclear plants operate under some of the strictest rules on Earth. You can't skip steps. You can't improvise. You can't say, we'll fix it next week. A nuclear reactor forces everyone around it to become precise, structured, calm, and accountable. And that's exactly what Coburg's workforce became, decade after decade. Every year, staff undergo intense retraining. Operators practice emergency simulations. Inspectors analyze the smallest changes in equipment behavior. Every incident, no matter how minor, gets documented, reviewed, and corrected. Every maintenance cycle is planned years ahead. This is the kind of environment where excellence becomes a habit. And something extraordinary happened along the way. South Africa built one of the strongest technical talent pipelines on the continent. Many of Africa's top nuclear engineers either trained at Coburg or learned from people who did. That's why when Egypt began building its El Dabaa nuclear plant, when Nigeria started exploring small modular reactors, when Kenya formed its nuclear authority, they all referenced Coburg, not as a warning, but as a model. You see the irony? The world thought Africa would learn nuclear technology from the West. Instead, Africa is learning it from Africa. This is why the 20-year extension feels bigger than just regulatory approval. It's validation. Proof that Africans not only understand nuclear engineering but can sustain it for generations. And now, with a renewed license, an experienced workforce, and a stable regulatory framework, Coburg can keep training the next wave of African nuclear professionals. Which brings us to the next question, because having the talent is one thing, but understanding how this fits into the nation's long-term strategy is another. So the real issue now becomes, how does Coburg's extension strengthen South Africa's broader energy transition and long-term national planning? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Every country talking about energy transition loves to show off solar fields, wind farms, green hydrogen roadmaps, and big climate pledges. But here's the truth. Nobody wants to admit publicly. None of those dreams survives without stable baseload power underneath them. Zero. Nothing. You cannot build a modern, resilient, low-carbon future if your grid collapses the moment the weather changes. And this is exactly where Coburg becomes the quiet hero of South Africa's entire energy blueprint. South Africa's official plan, IRP 2025, the Integrated Resource Plan, is ambitious. It envisions a future where renewable energy grows massively, where battery storage stabilizes peak demand, where cleaner gas infrastructure fills the gaps, where hydropower integrates with regional partners, and where South Africa gradually reduces its dependence on coal. But here's the part that matters. All of that depends on having one unshakable anchor, an electricity source that does not care about rain, wind, sunlight, droughts, or fuel price spikes. Something that remains rock solid while everything else fluctuates. Nuclear power is that anchor, and Coburg is the only nuclear anchor Africa has right now. Imagine IRP 2025 without Coburg. South Africa would have faced a devastating hole, nearly 2,000 megawatts disappearing from the grid at the worst possible time. To replace that with renewables alone would require enormous land, billions in investment, dozens of new transmission lines, and storage capacity that doesn't yet exist at scale. To replace it with gas? Impossible without driving up costs and creating new dependencies on imported fuel. To replace it with coal? Politically toxic, environmentally unacceptable, economically backward. So what does the 20-year extension give South Africa? Breathing room. That's what. It gives the country time, precious, irreplaceable time, to build new infrastructure properly instead of rushing into panic decisions. Think about the industries this stabilizes: automotive manufacturing, mining, smelting, cement, digital infrastructure, logistics hubs, port operations, water treatment plants. Every single one of these sectors needs reliable power or they collapse. Investors will not build billion-dollar factories in a country where the electricity goes off unpredictably. Renewable energy alone cannot guarantee that stability yet, but nuclear can. And Coburg has been doing exactly that quietly for 40 years. Now imagine the opportunity. With 2 more decades of secure baseload power, South Africa can finally push forward on big ambitions: EV production, green hydrogen exports, African battery manufacturing, deep tech clusters, and massive renewable corridors. Without Coburg, these dreams would be impossible. With Coburg, they become achievable. This is why the extension is not just a technical approval. It is a national stabilizer, a strategic pillar. A safety net prevents the entire transition from collapsing. And what South Africa does successfully often becomes a roadmap for the continent. Which brings us to the final and deepest question of all. If Coburg is now secured as Africa's nuclear anchor, what does this single plant mean for Africa's collective future? And how does it reshape the continent's global standing? Coburg is no longer just a power station. It is Africa's announcement to the world that the continent will define its own energy destiny. For decades, Africa's story was written by others. Multilateral lenders wrote the appropriate solutions. And most of those solutions kept Africa dependent. Endless diesel imports, donor-funded solar panels, emergency interventions, temporary fixes that looked good in reports but failed on the ground. But then comes Coburg, standing on the Cape Coast like a quiet rebellion. A reminder that Africa does not need to be told what it can or cannot handle. A reminder that Africa can operate the most advanced and sensitive technologies humans have ever created. A reminder that African engineers, not foreign contractors, kept this reactor stable through storms, political transitions, economic turbulence, and global energy crises. And now, with its license extended to 2045, Coburg becomes a symbol, an inspiration for the entire continent. Think about Egypt, building the massive El Dabaa nuclear station with Russian support. When it switches on, it'll generate 4,800 megawatts, more than double the output of Coburg. Think about Nigeria, preparing for small modular reactors that could power industrial zones and transform the national grid. Think about Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, Rwanda, countries laying the legal and scientific foundations for nuclear adoption. These nations are looking at Coburg and saying, if South Africa could build this culture of safety, so can we. And they're right. Africa's future energy landscape will not be defined by scarcity. It will be defined by ambition. Nuclear energy gives Africa something no other energy source can promise at this moment: decades of stable, clean, predictable power on which entire economies can be built. Not 3 years, not 5 years, decades. Imagine the Africa of 2040, an Africa where renewable energy thrives because nuclear provides the stability beneath it. An Africa where countries export green minerals not as raw ore, but as finished products because electricity is abundant. An Africa where manufacturing hubs rival Asia because the continent no longer suffers from chronic power instability. An Africa where data centers, robotics facilities, EV industries, and biotech labs operate at global standards because the grid no longer collapses. Coburg is the first domino in that chain. Its success sends a shockwave across the continent. A psychological shift, a new confidence. It tells African leaders, you don't have to accept limited options. You can leap directly into high-tech, high-precision energy systems that even wealthy nations struggle to manage. And here's the part the world did not expect. Africa is not afraid of that future. Africa is running toward it. Because if one African country can run nuclear flawlessly, what happens when 10 African nations master it? That's the question the world isn't ready for, and the future Africa is preparing to answer. Do you think more African countries should follow South Africa's path and build their own nuclear power plants? Let us know in the comments section. If Africa masters nuclear energy, which global power do you think will panic first? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.